As we close this section on the Reformation and Renaissance, we're going to close with a look at the Council of Trent, which will be the Roman Catholic Church's opportunity to take a look at the power of tradition, the way in which they've been doing business for quite a number of generations and centuries. And it's as if one of the ways that oftentimes this is covered is the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak. The complaints, the long-term trends in Protestantism in Europe are highlighted with the idea that they, of course, are increasingly bringing on drastic changes into Europe. Meanwhile, the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholicism will, for the most part, maintain the loyalty of most of people in Europe, especially the southern half. And of course, as we move forward and the export of many Europeans to the New World, they will bring with them their religious traditions, and Roman Catholicism will spread even wider and further in other places outside of Europe. But for now, the council that we're talking about is called the Council of Trent. It's going to be meeting on again, off again over a period of about 20 years. And what it's going to be doing, and this is an artistic depiction of it, it was an attempt, a sincere attempt to go back and take a look at some of the ideas that had been proposed by many of the religious thinkers of the last century or so, take a look at the way in which the papacy was operating, College of Cardinals, everything that was involving the church, and then have a conversation about why we do what we do and where we go with where we go. All right, with that idea in mind then, the Council of Trent was going to have to deal with several issues. One, it eventually, after a series of conversations and investigations, reaffirmed the 7 sacraments that had been traditionally practiced in the countries of Christian Europe. That it reaffirmed the idea that the sacraments, as they were done properly, and that's, of course, marriage and extreme unction and baptism and other ideas like that had been practiced in the medieval church. It reaffirmed that those are distinctive sort of moments, monuments in the lives of all Christians, where they were able to document for themselves and for their community their commitment to the faith. Those were all reaffirmed. Remember, the Protestants had reduced down the sacraments essentially to 2, thinking in terms that was the best way to support what they saw in Scripture. Roman Catholic tradition will keep 7. The arguments on those are worthy of a deeper look someplace else, but not in this lecture. What I want you to see, though, is that there is a sincere effort to go back and say, okay, well, what are we doing? Why do we do it? And they reaffirm a lot of the traditional understandings of what's happening. So, reaffirm the 7 sacraments. Reaffirm the idea that true, faithful, penitent Christians do live and do works in the world that demonstrate their faith. That the origins of those works, the origins of what they're physically doing, are seen in their spiritual, in their inside. Their spiritual needs, their spiritual commitment is being projected outwards and seen as works. Many remember, like Calvin and Luther, and even Erasmus for that matter, had been a bit skeptical of people's external manifestations of faith, that there was a lot of show there without having a clear understanding of what was in the heart and what was in the brain. The church reaffirms at this point in time that is valuable to have that external experience, that external expression of your faith, and that it is not some sort of deception. It is a true penitent Christian's ability to engage in the world and show their faith in a physical way. They also affirmed basically the power of tradition, that the way in which the church had been doing business was fully acceptable, justified, and worked. One claim, for example, we talked very briefly about Emperor Charles V in the Holy Roman Empire. At one point in time, when he was referring to Luther, essentially he said, how could one monk overturn 1,500 years of tradition? All right? And there's a sentiment there that for many people, as they look at the way in which the Christian church was operating in Western Europe, see great value in what they're doing, great power, great tradition, and they understand what it is and that it's meaningful to them. And for somebody to come along and challenge all those things, upsetting the apple cart, so to speak, in many ways was a great challenge and very confusing to many people who see something that was traditional, successful, and working, and somebody coming in claiming that it's not. That was one of the central elements that really confused people in this time period. They also reaffirmed the idea of clerical power. And what we mean by that is that the power of the church to organize the structured life of a Christian. Seminaries, came out of the idea of the Council of Trent. They're going to create independent training grooms. Many of the priests in earlier traditions of Europe, some had been trained in universities, some had sort of served kind of like an apprenticeship kind of a thing. There had been no standardized one-size-fits-all way to create the next generation of priests. This Council of Trent is going to advocate that basically all across Europe they set up seminaries. They set up specific training schools for the clergy who are going to be working with people in the countryside and in the individual parishes, making sure that they have the education level and the abilities to successfully conduct that mission of the church in the larger community. They were also reassessing the idea of clerical power by saying, for example, we're going to continue to have the Bishop of Rome, we're going to continue to have the College of Cardinals, we're going to have the structure of bishops and archbishops and dioceses, right, the formation blocks of the church. They're reaffirming what they already have and justifying why it is on the basis of, essentially, if you want to put it this way, if it isn't broke, you don't fix it. So if you're not seeing something as broken, the impetus to change it it's not there. So with that idea in mind, they're reaffirming tradition, they're reaffirming what they're all doing. And one of the things they're also going to do is they're going to be reaffirming what is called transubstantiation. Okay. For the longest time, the Christian movement had very confusing understandings of what they thought the Last Supper was. Now, in the Christian tradition, the Christ figure in the story raises a cup of wine and a piece of bread and says that this is my body and this is my blood. All right. Now, for many groups of Christians, that was a symbolic act, right? Holding up the bread and holding up the wine was symbolism. For others, it was the absolute transformation, the transubstantiation of that wine into blood and that bread into bone, into flesh. That was the idea. The Holy Eucharist, the Holy Communion was a direct link back into this ceremony and a direct symbol and connection to the divine. Now, some see it as symbolism, some see it as transubstantiation. The Protestant thinkers had gone back and forth, and many of them saw it simply as symbolism. Many of them also, like Luther, had the idea of consubstantiation, believing that, well, God can be wherever God wants to be, whether you say he's there or not. But in the Catholic tradition, increasingly, it was only a trained priest who could actually, using the ceremony at the high altar, do the official change of the bread into bone and the blood into wine. And that would then be presented to the laity in the church. Lots of traditions there, but the idea is that the church is going to continue to have control over that, and the clerics are going to be the ones who have that charge. All right? So here's what's happening at the Council of Trent by the time it closes. They are going to reaffirm the tradition of the church. They're also in many ways going to deny some of the central features of what the Protestants have been complaining about. They're also going to see that for many people, if you are looking at the way in which religion is operating in Western Europe, you can see a massive intrusion of political power as many princes convert and then take over church territory. That seems to be kind of a, I'll use the word skeezy kind of way of thinking about conversions. It doesn't seem very heartfelt. It seems to be simply on the basis of economics. There's also some debate about whether, some of these issues in theology had already been settled in the Middle Ages, which ones were still open. Some of those cracks earlier now had become giant fissures and canyons. You can't heal those breaks in just an easy way, and all attempts to do so will essentially fail for most people across Europe. One thing that will happen, though, is the church will make a sort of a double down on some of the ideas they'd had before. Go back in time for a second. Back in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, Pope Innocent III, a very powerful pope at the time, had recognized that there was a divergence between what the church was doing and what the common people, the laity, were understanding. That's why the foundation of things like the Franciscan movement under St. Francis of Assisi and the Dominican movement under St. Dominic, they had been the kind of street warriors. The church was going to take their idea, their mission, and they're not going to go cloistered on a hill in the countryside someplace. They're going to take it to the people. That had been a successful model back in the 13th century, and so the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, are now going to be formed in this time period under St. Ignatius of Loyola as a direct arm, a truly dependent, penitent arm of the Roman Catholic Church, men to take a vow to be as priests and to work directly with people, and increasingly the Jesuits will be involved in missionary activity, educational activity, running different schools, and they get a reputation at this time period of essentially being the sort of the foot soldiers of the Pope in terms of going back and bringing people into the Catholic fold. This is the accomplishments of the Council of Trent. It reaffirmed the power of tradition. It reaffirmed that the church could go back and be out that church militant again, get out in the streets again, get back to the people, and the Jesuits are one reflection of that. It was also, though, in many ways, sort of a closing point where many of the ideas the Protestants had tried to push were seen as not helpful and or counterproductive. And for some people in Europe, the idea of having the local prince also be the head of the church will create massive problems. And we'll see that as we move into the next sector here of lectures. So to close out this part here about the Reformation and Renaissance time period, we have then an explosion of different ideas and concepts. There is a significant amount of intellectual as well as military conflict, and in each case, they're trying to come to some resolution, but the resolution is not singular, it will be plural. It's going to head Europe down the road of creating a more tolerant place, if they're willing to accept toleration. If nothing else, it means that the old ways of doing business in all things will increasingly be challenged. Take a look and see in your reading material that you have a good grasp of this time period, and also see if there are some of the sample questions that can help you address some of the key issues here in this time period.